Today we're going to look at a guy called Yair Davidi. Now this guy, I've been aware of him for about 4 or 5 years now, and I thought his channel would have well blown up by now and his information would have exploded. But it seems as though he's one of these characters whose information just seems to get nowhere, and he spent a lifetime researching this topic. And the topic is the lost tribes of Israel and how they migrated westwards, across the Danube River into Northern Europe, the tribe of Denmark, Daneland and all that kind of stuff, obviously into Britain, and the royal family being representatives of the House of David via the coronation, the symbology, the bloodlines and all that kind of good stuff. But today we're just going to take a quick look at Yair. This is only a 15-minute long video, and I just want to give people an introduction to this man. This is a bit more information. I'm trying to get some information across that I think is going to help further down the line when I start unloading things in greater detail. But yeah, let's get to it. This is Yair. Scythians and
Yair Davidi speaking from land of Israel. Today we are about to discuss what happened to the Israelites after they were exiled, or at least concerning a portion of the Israelites after they were exiled. Israelites, I mean the lost 10 tribes. We had 12 tribes of Israel that were together in the land of Israel. First they were in one kingdom under the king Saul, after that David, Solomon. In the time of the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, the northern tribes, 10 of the tribes separated. They set up their own kingdom in the north. Under Yair ben Nabat from the tribe of Ephraim, they established their own kingdom. After more than a century, this kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians, taken into exile, and they lost consciousness of their ancestry. This did not happen overnight. They went through a process of being taken into exile, resettled in another area, assimilating themselves into the framework of the Assyrian Empire, serving in various capacities, and eventually rebelling against the Assyrians and federating the other peoples and migrating with them. So we know something about...
Sorry, I just want to mention in there as well, he's talking about how they were conquered, the Scythians were conquered by the Assyrians. Well, yes, that is true, but this is after the Scythians had conquered lands in Sumer. Now, I think Herodotus, I believe it was, made claim that the area during his time to where the Scythians resided was former Sumerian Empire territory. So it goes to show, there was this engagement between the steppes and the lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates. This kind of interaction and engagement had been taking place for a while.
What happened to a portion of them in this period, and that is what we are about to discuss, and this is also hinted at in the Bible and confirmed by archaeological findings and Assyrian inscriptions and the like, and other sources. And we're just going to go through it very quickly, give an overall view, because in other works and in other talks we have gone into it in more detail. So Micah, the chapter 5, actually describes this. It gives a comprehensive summary of what happened. In principle, all the prophets prophesied concerning the future, especially what will happen in the end times. Prophecy is mainly concerned for the end times. Well, the sages said that prophecies that were written down are concerned with what happens in the end times, but often they describe events that took place in their own time or shortly after their own time.
Yeah, that's good, because I was just about to mention we've seen reoccurring patterns throughout human history where, going back especially the last 2,000 years, say since Christ, predominantly in the West, the fear that this could be the last generation, the book of Revelation, the book of Genesis and things like that, have been active in the minds of Western philosophy in the past 2,000 years. And every generation there's been groups of people within that generation who thought that they were going to be the last generation, and this was the Antichrist. You know, you go back in the last 200 years, for example, you know, you've had civil wars right across Europe and in the West. You've had two world wars. You've had like the receding of the British Empire, the rising of the American Empire, if you will, the Chinese Communist Empire, excuse me, the fall of the Russian Empire or the Tartarian Empire, whichever way you want to look at that. So we've seen through history, you know, like I say, that, especially the last couple of hundred years, every generation, there's a certain group of people who live in fear that they are going to be the last generation.
Often they describe events that happened, that took place in their own time or shortly after their own time. So we may say that this is an example of prototypical prophecy, especially prophets who came after Moses, the prophets who came after Moses. Moses was in a different category. Moses spoke to God panim, face to face, and he had a direct understanding. The other prophets were different. They understood things by way of similes and metaphors. They were more limited, one could say, in their revelation, in their degree of revelation. And a prophet would intuit, he would understand what was going to happen shortly after his time. Sometimes within his time, sometimes 100 or so years afterwards. He would have a feeling of what would happen, and he would be right. It would be prophesied what would happen in that time, but he would change it somewhat, and he'd also use this picture that he had a grip on, one could say, because it was close to him, because what happens in the future, in the near future, is a direct outgrowth of what is happening in the present. So he'd have more of a grip on what was happening then, and from then he would extrapolate through divine inspiration into the distant future. So that these prophecies or these descriptions of what was happening or about to happen are reliable or are useful for us to understand what happened then. And
Excuse me. See, I understand where he's going with this, and I think you guys probably do as well. The point of this video is not really to get hung up on the interpretation of prophets. He's getting a little bit off track here. I thought he might have stayed on point a bit more, but the point of this video is really to show you that in the scriptures there's a succession of movements of the tribes and of the peoples. Somehow the translation of this got lost, the interpretation of this got lost, but genetics is the answer right now. Genetics has proven a lot of the things that he's touched on briefly, and hopefully he's going to come on to in a minute. So yeah, I just want to say, I don't want to skip through his video. I want to give this man his moment here, but try not to get too caught up on the philosophical elements, and rather look at the migration, the historical elements, if you will.
for us to understand what happened then, and that also intended for us to somehow understand what will happen in the end times. So this is what happened. This is the case of the book of Micah, chapter 5, and he describes what happened when the Israelites were exiled, and they associated themselves with the Scythians, became associated with the Scythians, and overthrew the Assyrian Empire. How we understand it from the Bible, from other sources, from archaeological findings and so on, is that the Israelites were taken into exile into certain specific areas. We can trace many of these areas. We can find records of the Israelites from Samaria, from the 10 tribes, serving in the Assyrian armies, and on occasion sometimes reaching high rank or having important tasks to fulfill in these areas, being governors, being...
Sorry, and this is more like the historical stuff I was talking about. Like I say, there's texts, obviously clay tablets in textual form, and this kind of thing that has shed light now on certain elements of scripture that 200-300 years ago was impossible to fathom. Really, it was all conjecture. Nowadays we've pulled a lot of stuff out the ground. A lot of languages are being decoded, and the the science is catching up with the theory in essence. And yeah, like I say, obviously the Scythians have got a relation to, I mentioned this in a previous video, there's a connection there to Noah, and a few generations below Noah. And like I say, that the integration of peoples globally, really, but especially once you go back a few thousand years and you start looking to where the people started migrating out of, from denser population centres to more rural areas, and then you overlay this onto like older maps. This is where again places like Tartaria and all this start coming into play, and then you hear of Herodotus, Homer, you know, these great Greek philosophers, there's Italian philosophers, there's even Middle Eastern philosophers who paint such a different picture of our history than what's in the textbooks currently. Like I say, I'm not gonna tell anyone to go and pick up a Bible or a Quran or Bhagavad Gita, but if you go and look in these books, there's obviously an element. It seems as though there's an element of fantasy wrapped around an element of truth, and this is where the interpretations and all that can start getting a bit crazy. Like I said, I'm not going to tell anyone to go and read these books, but I'd recommend that anyone does, because once you gain this knowledge and you can start mapping it against real life situations and archaeological data, you start to build a more three-dimensional picture. Let's get back to Yari.
The Assyrian armies, on occasion sometimes reaching high rank or having important tasks to fulfill in these areas, being governors, being high up in the Assyrian hierarchy, or also just simply serving as farmers, as servants, some cases as slaves and stone quarries. We have all different things happen to different sections of the Israelite exiles. So a portion of them became quite powerful. They were independent to some degree, or had autonomy. The Assyrians were under the attack from the enemies, and the internal power of the Israelites grew. Whereas at the same time, a portion of them rebelled against Assyria. And they became independent of Assyria, whereas others were attached as federated forces, auxiliary forces to the Assyrian Empire. And due to a combination of circumstances, they managed at one stage, to take over the Assyrian Empire. At this same time, the kingdom of Judah, which had been subservient to Assyria, it also had enjoyed a degree of autonomy, but it had been subservient to Assyria. As a new king called Josiah, the son of Ammon, and of the kingdom of Judah, became independent. He too more or less asserted his independence from Assyria by turning back to the worship of the god of Isael, since the Assyrians more or less insisted that their vassal kingdoms worship the gods of Assyria. So Josiah rebelled against them, threw down the statues in the places of worship of the pagans, and asserted his independence. And he made contact with the Scythians, who at the same time were establishing their control over Assyria and shaking off the Assyrian yoke. Other Israelites at the same time had joined with the enemies of Assyria, such as the Medes and the Babylonians, and these other Israelites were in turn part of the Cimmerian forces. The Cimmerians and the Scythians were virtually one and the same people, federated groups of similar culture, and they are known in the Bible as Gomer. They are represented in the book of Hosea under the name of Gomer, showing that the Israelites had had conjoined themselves with other peoples and were part of them to some degree. So this group of peoples was known as Gomer in the generic sense. A portion of the Gomer were the Scythians. So some of the
Sorry, I just need to mention as well, like you said, the Israelites did make partnerships, allegiances with other peoples, and this is not isolated. Like this is not the start of this kind of activity. If you go back to the land of Canaan, when you had the Phoenicians and the Israelites back then, the Jews, if you will, the Phoenicia and the Jews had like a kind of understanding and a pact and an arrangement, and obviously as time went by, this pact and arrangement broke down, and then it turned into turmoil and war, etc. But it goes to show you that, you know, the Israelites have got a history of aligning themselves with certain groups, certain entities, certain kingships for protection against others. So obviously at the time, Phoenicia was a very dominating force in the Med. Obviously they had the ships and all this kind of great stuff. So the Israelites at the time were very smart people, and obviously we've already been engaged with the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the people around the Caucasus and northwest into Europe, etc. But they continue to make alliances as they continue to migrate.
Sumerians were in effect attacking Syria, whereas others, under the name of Scythians, were defending Assyria. Eventually, those Scythians who were defending Assyria changed sides and joined with the Medes and the Babylonians, and together with the Medes they attacked the city of Nineveh and other Assyrian cities and destroyed them. And indications are that the Scythians played the major role in these military actions. The book of Micah in its own way describes this. Together with other sources, we have the following picture, as it says in the book of Micah, chapter 5, "And this man shall be the beast when the Syrians shall come into our land, and he, that is the Syrians, shall tread in our palaces." And archaeological findings do show how the Assyrians tread in the palaces of the Samaria, of the Israelites, and destroyed them. "Then shall we rise against him, against Assyria, 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. And they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod, and the entrances thereof. And the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, as a Jew from the Lord. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles, in the midst of many peoples, as a lion among the flocks of sheep."
So there you go, you got the line of Jacob. So the line of Jacob, as my interpretation, is more so the lost tribes, if you will, where you've got the line of David, which could be interpreted as maybe like the royal family or the aristocracy of like the European elite, if you will. Whether they're aware of this or not, who knows, but they certainly act out their membership when the royal family is anointed, for example. As I say, the throne, the coronation chair is a representation of the chair of David that once stood in the Temple of Solomon. You've got all these little elements, you know, tabernacles getting placed above before the anointing of the holy water, the stone of destiny itself that the royals are coronated on is believed to be the stone of Jacob, going back thousands of years, linked to Jacob himself. So, like, say for me personally, I probably would say I'm one of the members of the lost tribe of Jacob, where again we have a more elitist class, which is the line of David. And as he says there, the line of Jacob will be in amongst the Gentiles. So basically it's the working class, the line of David, sorry, the line of Jacob, the descendants of Jacob have actually filtered out into the working classes. We are part of just your everyday people, just rubbing shoulders, going to the shops, playing sports, you know, all interacting on every level with the Gentiles.
Peoples as a lion among the flocks of sheep. So as we said, the main point of these verses may be applicable in the end times, events that will happen in the end times, but nevertheless they also describe what happened shortly after the Israelites were exiled, and this is the way of prophecy as we have described it. So too, after the book of Micah, we have the book of Nahum. Nahum in the Bible, Nahum was also one of the minor prophets. As we said, the minor prophets are called minor prophets because they had short books. Their books were not as long as the major prophets. They were not like the major prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah. They are major prophets because they have long books. The minor prophets have short books, and they're all put together or written up often in one roll of parchment. And they were known as the 12 minor prophets. And Nahum was one of them, as Micah was one of them. The book of Nahum comes in its reading after the book of Micah. And the book of Nahum describes the destruction of Nineveh and of Assyria and of related events. It's a short book, and that is what is mainly concerned with the destruction of Nineveh and other Assyrian places. And as we said, the Assyrians had destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, that exiled the 10 tribes in their places of exile. The Israelites became attached to the Sumerians and Scythians and identified with them. Then they rebelled against Assyria. Meanwhile, the Medes and the Babylonians waged war against her. The Assyrians at first were allied with the Assyrians. For a time they took over the Syrian Empire. Then they lost control, and after that they joined forces with the Medes. And began to attack Assyria and played a major role in destroying the Assyrian cities. We have a passage in the book of Nahum, Nahum chapter 2 verse 3, as it says in for instance, the King James book, the King James Bible. It says, Nahum 2:3 says, "For the Lord hath turned away the excellency of Jacob, as the excellency of Israel. For the empty years have emptied them out, and married their vine branches." The point is, however, that in Hebrew,
Like I say, he's sometimes a little bit hard to follow, Yari, because he's a guy that's full of so much knowledge, and he's like myself. He doesn't actually write nothing down. He tends to go with his feelings, go where the information he feels needs to go. So just bear with him. And like I say, if someone has watched this, please just, if anything sticks out what you hear him say, go and Google it. Just Google that line, go on YouTube that line, see if there's any documents, information, or further clips that you can further educate yourself on. Because this is a process that never ends, really. You find one thing out, and that thing just means that you need to find 3 or 4 more things. Like I say, never ending process. This guy's obviously coming towards the end of his journey, and he's got a lot of knowledge, but he can't give you all the knowledge that's inside his head. He can only give you take the horse to water, the horse has got to drink itself. He can give us the clues, and we've got to try and pick them up. Not to say that everything he says is accurate and correct, but it's a good basis to launch different ideas from, and try and wrap your head around the grander questions that we have.
the point is, however, that in Hebrew this verse may actually be rendered differently. It may be translated directly from the Hebrew as saying this: "The Lord has returned the pride of Jacob, as the pride of Israel, and also the pride of Israel, of the 10 tribes. Because in that time, both Judah and the 10 tribes had rebelled against Assyria. For they who have emptied them out are being emptied out by them. And they will destroy their vines. They will destroy the vineyards and the centers of civilization of Assyria." That is how Nahum 2:3 may be understood. And this also fits in with our scenario concerning Micah, speaking about the 10 tribes of Israel. We will run through again Micah 5, a portion of it, just to emphasize how Micah is describing these events. He says, verse 5, he says, Micah 5:1, "Now muster your troops, O daughter of troops. Siege is laid against us. With a rod they strike the judge of Israel on the cheek. But thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days." David, the house of David, came from Bethlehem. Apparently they came from Bethlehem, which was a small township in the region of Ephrathah in Judah. And it was a small area, it was insignificant, and people were surprised that such an outstanding personality such as David should emerge from such a place. And he goes on, "Therefore shall give them up until the time when she is in labour shall have given birth. Then the rest of his brothers shall return to the people of Israel." That is, the 10 tribes shall return and be reunited with the rest of Israel. "And he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. And they shall dwell secure, for now it shall be great to the ends of the earth." Now he's speaking about end times, And the Messiah, son of David, shall come and shall restore the Israelites to their former possessions and to their former greatness, and his name shall be great unto the ends of the earth, and eventually they shall establish their rulership over most peoples of the earth. And as well as having application for the end times, it also has applications for the time of the Syrian downfall. It also says in verse 5, and he shall be their peace when the Assyrian comes into our land. The Assyrian comes into our land and treads in our palaces. Then we will raise up against him 7 shepherds and 8 princes of men. They shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword. At the beginning, the Scythians were allies. The Israelites with the Scythians were allies of Assyria. Well, they became that.
Also as well, the Scythians were obviously, even though they were known as quite nomadic, they were shepherds. They moved their livestock with them. They weren't really known as great agricultural. They weren't a great agricultural society. They tended to live more off meat and livestock. Again, I believe it's Herodotus goes on to mention things like they grew hemp, you know, like cannabis. They used cannabis to grow clothes. To make clothes, to make things for the sheets for the tents, footwear. You know, they made all kinds out of hemp, which obviously we know today it can be done as well. Ropes, linens, and all that kind of stuff. Even used to have a ancient hot box where they'd stick hot stones in a tent, in a teepee shaped tent, and then they'd throw the seeds, cannabis seeds, on the hot rocks, and that would release the vapor and allow them to get high, basically, while the women would then take the leftover seeds, grind them up, and use it as an exfoliation cream for the skin. So I'm getting a bit off topic there, sorry, but yeah, they were a very nomadic society, and they were known as like shepherds. They were shepherds of men and shepherds of their own flocks, because they weren't lying in situ. They were always roaming around the great steppes and the plains. So that's fascinating how, you know, the Lord says he'd send the shepherds in, because these were known as basically as shepherds. You know, they rode around on horseback, they kept everything in check, and they were quite nomadic really, but fascinating. Just go back a touch.
The Israelites with the Scythians were allies of Assyria. Well, they became that way, and afterwards they took control of it, and then they were betrayed by Assyria or demoted by Assyria from that position. So they joined the enemies of Assyria and destroyed Assyria. Then, as it says, they shall shepherd the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod at its entrances. Nimrod is another name for Assyria. And he shall deliver us from the Assyrians, when he comes into a land and treads within our border. Then the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many peoples, like dew from the Lord, like showers on the grass, which delay not for a man, nor wait for the children of men. And the remnant of Jacob shall be among the nations, in the midst of many peoples, like a lion among the beasts of the forest.
See, that's interesting as well, because obviously as the nations migrated west into Europe and things like that, we know that like these major countries in Europe at the time, you know, and further into the future, into the last few hundred years, you know, you had like Great Britain, Portugal, Spain, France, Germany, Holland, and people forget about like the Habsburg Empire, which the Habsburg Empire itself was decreed, in fact, by the Holy Roman, by the Pope himself, to have been the empire of God, chosen by God. The people of the empire believed that it was a holy empire, if you will, and this wasn't necessarily the Charlemagne Holy Roman Empire, because obviously that was established through force as well as through divine right, if you will. But as time went further on, you know, there was certain elements of the Habsburgs and stuff like that, where people genuinely thought it was that it was a God-given right for these people to rule, and it was the best thing for them because they were a pious society, if you will. It wasn't really based on weapons and munitions. It was based more on technology and societal reform, and elevating society. And like I say, not to get too, I'm bouncing a little bit myself here, so I was talking about the older times and then fast forwarded a little bit. But if you want to scroll back again, all these tribes, they migrated into these nations of Europe that became the nations of Europe, and then they migrated globally through their own empires. Like I say, the Dutch colonies, and Portuguese colonies, Spanish, French, British colonies, all these colonies all around the world, and they all originated from a similar migration going all the way back to the time of the Scythians and post-Scythian, and not to mention pre-Scythian from the Phoenicians, etc., when they travelled around and ended up taking lands in Britain and trading with the people of Britain, Brittany, the land of tin, etc. So this, like I say, the scriptures, the history, the mythology, the architecture, the archaeology, it's all a twisted mess. But as time goes by, you start to learn from as many sources as you can. You can start to navigate your way through, and you can see this migration all the way to the point where he's just used those words. Like the people, the descendants of Jacob will be amongst the sheep, amongst the flock. They'll no longer be a shepherd, but be part of the flock. And I don't want to, again, like I say, we all get sucked into this, are we in the end times? Is it our time now? Well, I don't necessarily think it is. It could be, but it's just interesting that you look around now and you see, the remnants of, from what I can say, the British Empire, because I understand more the history of it, and the fact that we helped populate such large countries and parts of the world, and we're such a small island. It's almost like there was some kind of it was meant to be aspect to it, if you follow me. But yeah, video's nearly over now. PC's not working.
Like a young lion among the flocks of sheep, which when it goes through, treads down and tears in pieces. There's none to deliver. Verse 9, and your hand shall be lifted up over your adversaries, and all your enemies shall be cut off. And then he just goes on, and then he describes the destruction of the elimination of paganism from out of the land, as King Josiah did, and as the Messiah, the future Messiah, son of David, will also do. So there's much more along these lines, but it all tells us that the Bible is true. Not only that the Bible is true, it teaches us how to understand history. It gives us insights into what happened to history, how it really happened, which is consistent with other findings. And it also tells us, or gives us, an indication of what will happen in the end times. And this was written down in order that we should know it and understand it as well as we could. May the Lord God of Israel bless you. Thank you.
Right, so there we go. That's Yair Davidi. Like I say, I hope people go and check this guy out. He's got a wealth of information on his channel. As I said, thanks for stopping by. Catch you in the next one. Peace.